My name is Sydney Stubbs, and I chose to do my capstone over assessment. My competency statement is I am competent at using informal assessment and differentiating instruction to meet all students' needs. My questions today are how can a teacher effectively use assessment to guide his or her instruction to meet all the needs of students, and what are the components of effective assessment? My first piece of evidence came from my very first practicum experience. It's a lesson plan that I used. I taught a lesson over contractions such as can't, shouldn't, wouldn't, couldn't, etc. And looking back, I realized that I didn't know what assessment was or how it was used in teaching. So I never really understood what I was teaching, and neither did my students, I don't think. So the objective of the lesson was I would give them a kite that they had to make. The top piece was the contraction, so in this case it would be can't. And then on the two bows beneath that, they would write the two words that make that contraction. In my lesson, I allude to assessing my students. I write that we will meet together as a group and go over the results of the activity, but on that day we were running short on time. And I gave my students the choice to either keep their kite or throw it away, which then took the opportunity to assess away from myself. A week later, I was grading my students' phonics papers over contractions, and I realized that they did in fact understand what I had taught them, but I never made the connection between what I taught and what they learned. So that takes me to my second piece. It's from Math Block. It's a child interview. I wrote out 3 math tasks and planned out questions that I was going to ask my student that would help me get a better picture of my student's understanding. So when I chose my student for this particular assignment, I thought to myself, I know that I can use this to guide my future instruction, so what student do I want to be using? And I decided to use a student who was on grade level but generally needed the full 50 minutes of math instruction to understand the content. If I would have chosen a student who was above grade level and learned very quickly, I would make my future lessons too hard for a lot of my students. But if I chose a student who was below grade level, I wouldn't make my lessons challenging enough, and my students wouldn't be challenged. I wouldn't know their full potential. So I asked my student these questions, and I screenshotted her work and wrote down some of the quotes and some of her understanding on this assignment. And from this, I understood that she did understand how to do doubles, but her adding 2-digit numbers and partners of 10 were still difficult for her. In this paper, I even wrote that I would like to address the partners of 10 to the class as a whole because I had seen that in other students as well. So then from this, I created a lesson plan that I used about 2 weeks later, and I was able to take the previous students' misconceptions and design activities and higher order thinking questions, as well as develop clear instruction that would meet the needs of all of my students. So I was able to take her misconception and make a higher order thinking question for my students that excelled, as well as make a question that was a little bit lower level for the students that were still struggling to get their basic understandings. That takes me into my next piece of evidence. My third piece of evidence is from my time student teaching. I was in a special education classroom teaching a second grade math lesson. The second grade team made it a goal that their students would have a better understanding of number sense, and in order to assess this, they wanted their students to make math mountains for addition and subtraction problems. So for this, I gave each of my students a card, which was also a missing component of the math mountain, and I taped the other 2 pieces, so the rest of the math mountain around the room. I asked my students to go and complete the math mountain. I walked around to my students and talked to them individually as they were solving this and solving these math mountains, which is something I didn't do in my first lesson, and I was able to help the students that were struggling and talk to them about what they were struggling with and find their misconceptions so that I could help them understand that better. My students that were doing really well with it, I gave more missing components so that they could continue and do a few more math mountains. So then at this point, I pulled the group back together as a whole, and we went to each math mountain in the classroom, and I said, who did this one? And the student that completed the math mountain would then raise their hand and step forward, and I would be able to ask them specific questions such as, did you have a partner or a total? And what strategy did you use? Did you use counting on or counting back? And I was able to identify that as well. After they answered my questions, I would then ask the rest of the class, do you agree with this? And is there a different way that you would have done it? If they said that there's a different way, I would allow them to explain that way. If they said that they agreed and it sounded good, we would move on to the next math mountain. So for my synthesis, I said that throughout my time in Teachers College, I have learned how teachers use assessment effectively and how they use it to guide their instruction, as well as the components of effective assessment. In my second piece of evidence, I showed that I used it to guide my future lessons. And in my student teaching, and I was also able to design higher order thinking questions from my second piece of evidence, as well as differentiate my lesson. From my student teaching, I showed that I was able to use the components of effective assessment. So that means that I was able to give specific feedback based on what my students told me that they knew individually. I was able to design assessment that aligned with the curriculum. So this particular activity forced them to use the counting on or counting back strategy that they had been taught earlier. And as well as an activity that aligned with the desired learning outcomes. So I wanted them to be able to know how to set up a math mountain and identify partners and totals, and this forced them to do that as well. For my reflection, I said that through my education at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, I have learned a variety of skills that have promoted a well-rounded education. I have learned how to be a better classroom teacher as well as special education teacher through the use of classroom and behavior management strategies, techniques in differentiating instruction, and the use of my assessment. In the last 4.5 years, my understanding of assessment has grown, and I have been able to use my understanding and the purpose of assessment to guide my future instruction. I also learned that the components of effective assessment are important to get a clear picture of my students' understanding, even when I am running low on instructional time. I am using it in my lessons to ask higher order thinking questions, observe my students, and listen to them explain their understanding. I now use the information I get from assessment to guide my lessons to help me differentiate instruction when needed. I have learned valuable information about assessment and have used it appropriately in my classroom instruction. However, I know that learning does not end, and I have a lot more to learn about effective assessment. So from here, I have set 2 goals for myself. One is to be able to use assessment in other content areas such as health, science, and social studies. Because there is such a focus on math, reading, and writing in the schools, I feel like I have not given assessment enough of a chance in the other areas that the students learn throughout the day. I also have a goal to use more technology in my assessment and find ways to have my students show their learning through different types of media, which would also then force me to bring more technology into my classroom.